and welcome to Let's Chat with Tony and Simon. Wow, Simon, do you realise this is episode number 38? We're getting closer and closer to 40.
Fantastic.
That's right. We've got a great show on today. But first, let's just introduce ourselves. My name's Tony Neal, and my business is Wellbeing. I call myself the Wellbeing Pathfinder, and I help individuals, business owners, via custom retreats, workshops, and consultations to maximise their feelings of vibrance, purpose, happiness, health, and success. And Simon, tell us what you do.
Yeah, well, good morning, Tony. How are you, my friend? Great to see you. Melbourne coming in from Tasmania. But for those that don't know me, my name is Simon Bowden, and I'm an international marketing business coach with over 25 years experience, which makes me a master coach. My mission is always to help my clients identify their aspirations and vision, strengths and blind spots, help them make informed decisions and take actions when needed to ultimately fast track them towards their personal goals. My coaching caters for executives and directors to entrepreneurs, small business owners and beyond. Whatever your situation, I'll help you build on your strengths and get clear on how to create a profitable future. I love what I do, and I'm passionate about helping my clients succeed, Tony, as you know.
Yes, that's beautiful. And you might also know that we've got our special guest today,
Yes.
who's Graham Clark. But before we do that, let's just read out what our mission is today. Just bear with me for a second while I fumble through the things. I nearly lost my voice there. Our mission, should we decide to accept it, is to educate and engage with our audience, with lively discussions with experts to gain their valuable experiences, tips and benefits of the business and well-being practices they can offer. Wow. Well, we've got a special show on for you. We're coming up, and here we go. And here we go, right, back again. I've got to fiddle with all the technology here. One day I'll get it right, Simon. One day.
Probably about our 60th or 70th episode, Tony. I think you'll pretty much have it.
That's right. We're well represented here today from Tasmania. Today we've got a special guest. Our special guest is Graham Clark. Now, Graham's got a very distinguished career. He's served in the military. He's been in a lot of community type of services for us. He was working with the fire brigades, and he's done a lot of other special SES type of activities. So I'll just introduce Graham, tell us, what have you been up to, Simon? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
You mean Graham?
Graham.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I gathered that. And look, first of all, thank you. Nice to be here, Tony, and also to meet you, Simon. So, well, I have been on a journey, and, I did scratch my head thinking, what do I talk about? And having been in a radio station and spoken about things before, generally they're of a community context, trying to motivate and get engagement from people that probably would think, look, I could sit around and someone else will do it for us. So my passion has been really rescue. And that began in my early 20s, where I had some really interesting dreams. And those dreams saw me driving a fire engine, for example. And at that stage, I didn't have a heavy truck license. And I remember sharing this with my dad, and because the dream was just so vivid and so really, really poignant that I actually, with excitement, shared it with my dad. And my dad says, "Oh no, you'll never do that." And I was like, "Oh," I didn't let that faze me, but I thought, "Oh, that's odd." And then I also then had another dream, and this, I don't know if you chaps remember in the UK, where I think it was Birmingham or something, that big castle that got on fire back in the early late I think it was early 90s. Do you remember
Yep.
the big castle, the Queens, that got on
Yeah,
fire?
yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I had about 2 o'clock in the morning. Yeah, I had a dream about that, and I just woke up out of bed, and I heard like this intuition voice saying to me, "Get up and turn on the television." And I just wrote that off. Thought that was a bit of a sham, and went to bed. Anyway, my parents had Sky TV back in those days, and I woke up about 6 in the morning, and they'd left it on the news channel. So the first thing I see at 6 in the morning is I see this big castle on fire, and I'm thinking, my gosh, I've dreamt this. And then I put two and two together and realized, gosh, when did they first start showing this on television? And of course, it was UK time. And I went back to being woken in the middle of my sleep, and this thing saying to me, "Get up and turn on the television." And I was like, wow. So from there on, after I got that message, I followed that particular direction, if you like. I don't know how I would put a label to that. And I joined the local fire brigade, and from there did many courses, and went up the ladder to eventually a brigade captain, and then what they call group officer status, which is another higher level above that again. So.
So, Simon, did you have a question?
Questions around that?
Yeah. So, tell us. You've obviously had some challenges on your journey, Graham. Would you like to share some of those with us?
Yeah. So, when we chat about challenges, everybody walks their journey. And I think in my case, I could only share with you what others that know me say. And one particular friend that I can think of that's known me for many years said he just doesn't know anyone that's been through the hard knocks in life like I have. Now, he lives a pretty recluse life, so there must be others out there like me. But there has been these situations of one knock after the other. And in particularly the one that I have just recently been through and has really motivated me and given me a direction that I had back in my early childhood was the survival of my own son, who was born with cardiac issues. And so we had the top surgeons in the country who basically said that he wouldn't survive. And, he's now almost 2 years, well, coming up a year and a half, 2 years after that conversation. So, yeah, that's probably been my biggest journey today.
Yeah. So what was the diagnosis?
Challenge?
Yeah. What was the diagnosis that they gave you?
So before he was born, it was terminal. So they said if he was born, he'd be in palliative care. But doctors are never right. And me and my wife, we went with our heart, and we didn't follow their advice. And everywhere we went, they kept telling us he wouldn't survive. There was no way that he was going to come out and survive and breathe on his own. And of course, so we had to go out of state, and then we went to Canberra. Canberra told us the same. We went out of state of Canberra. Thankfully, my wife had family in Queensland. And there he and my wife relocated to Queensland. And I mean, at this stage, he's not born. So, and from there, his birth was carried out in Queensland, because at that time I was really worried about a major fire hitting East Gippsland, which, of course, in hindsight, that's exactly what happened and devastated the whole far east of Victoria. So she went and ultimately took some of my kids, and I stayed behind looking after animals and fighting fires, trying to look after a community that had no food or water.
And Graham, what sort of strengths did you draw upon? Obviously, you would have had to have a lot of resilience to sort of get through all this, because I can imagine how difficult it would have been.
Yeah, I think, Tony, the resilience that I pulled upon was my experiences. And, when you've experienced different types of business, like one thing that I had the pleasure of being involved in was aviation rescue. And that was my ultimate goal in rescue. Even though I have a very strong and qualified fire background, my real passion in my heart was air rescue. So my wife supported me on that journey, and there was a particular time there where I went through some extensive studies in aviation medicine. Ended up working on the phones for a particular insurance company that did a lot of repatriation flights of people all around the world, and I was the chap that would organise those repatriation flights. And resilience is being also calm under pressure. And as more and more I progressed in leadership, I began to understand this thing about risk mitigation. And, risk mitigation, we could have an hour-long conversation on risk mitigation. But I think it ultimately, when you're in the decision of being a leader, that primarily becomes an absolute focus when you're dealing with human life, right? You have to look at risk mitigation, and that goes for business. Risk mitigation is never sometimes easy when you're dealing with people that may think you're not showing a hand, a humanitarian hand, for example. But we need to be able to sleep at night, and sometimes leadership requires those hard decisions, and often they're around risk mitigation, I find.
Yeah. Talking about leadership there, Graham, I noticed that in your bio that you're also involved with some of the major fires and things like that. In fact, you sort of had meetings with Dan Andrews and others at high levels. Can you just sort of tell us a little bit about that, what that really meant and how you helped out?
Sure. So I lived in the very far east of Victoria. I don't know if you remember Mallacoota.
Oh, yes. Beautiful part of the world.
So those fires, that's right, very fantastic place. And I was well aware, one road in, one road out, that when the big fire was going to come, there was going to be substantial devastation. And there's a number of reasons for that. And I won't go through, I won't use the word bore your listeners. Some of them would probably find it very interesting, but one road in, one road out, and you have surrounded by bush that's highly flammable. One day there's going to be a day of reckoning, and what Mallacoota would have is 10,000 people in one spot, and I'm talking plus 10,000 people, and normally that's the summertime, and these people are in caravans and different things like that. So what I realized, there was a deficiency from the leadership above me that hadn't looked at our community resilience. So I formed a team, and we lobbied politicians. At that time, there was the Emergency Management Commissioner, Craig Lapsley. I lobbied him to come down. And the moment that I started doing this, it showed up issues with other leaders that were on huge salaries that really weren't doing their job. So I banded a group of individuals within our community to basically engage the community on their bushfire risk. And from that, we worked extensively on putting in resilience infrastructure, like community radio. I did a lot of work on communications because there was a tower that was vulnerable. It could fail, and everybody in Mallacoota would use a cell phone. And if that communication went down, Telstra told me they'd fly in sat phones within 48 hours, but of course, in reality, that never happened. And so we ended up with the scenario that we did in Mallacoota, but it would have been a lot worse if all that infrastructure and different things hadn't been lobbied and put into place. Like, we had a fantastic crew of people that looked at generators and all these other bits of infrastructure. And gosh, the amount of time invested in all that was huge.
Yeah. So with you also mentioned that you've got a military training background as well. Can you just through what that looks like?
Yeah, well, I was involved in training basically the new recruit, and oh, there's many memories there, but I suppose the key thing was the organization did a subjective view of training, and I got very disheartened when I saw young people who really wanted to be there get removed because a certain instructor had a subjective outlook on that individual. It made me very despondent, because I don't believe you should be discouraged. I don't believe they should get a kick in the pants like that because someone doesn't like them. So I got off my ass, and excuse the French, and I decided to do something about it. And one of my colleagues was suggesting that we change a little exercise that we were doing. And then the moment that I saw that, I realized this was a moment to change the way that we trained. So I went about selling a vision to the CEO at the time, commanding officer, sorry, that's lingo, and was able to sell a pitch to him where we actually went about doing this particular exercise that was training related, where it actually made recruits become more self-autonomous. Basically, that means the instructors didn't have to yell at them, and it was a huge success. Yeah, that was probably one of my highlights, seeing that become successful within the military context, and it was based around training.
Yeah, Graham, I'm really interested in that. That's some of the strengths that you got from the military is that obviously you would have got a lot of self-discipline, and but also from what I'm hearing from you, you also you show a lot of empathy for other people and compassion. So would you like to sort of talk a little bit about those strengths, how that served you in life now?
Yeah, well, the military was a classic example. You end up with individuals that might not be self-confident, or we can even put up the word ethical. Okay.
Yes.
And what those individuals do is they see your strengths, and they create narratives, and they go around and sell, for example, your peers and above your peers, like your leaders, if you like. They'll sell a narrative that's not true, and then you're consistently fighting that narrative in your work environment. Yeah, I found that a challenge. I really did. That was, thinking back on that, to change a mindset where a very convincing narrative had gone out. And what I did is I always remained true to myself, where teamwork was essential. So if others did part of the work, I recognized and give recognition to those others. So in the case of the training program that I mainly developed, the leadership above me that hadn't really done anything, I acknowledged their input, and they too went along the ride of getting recognized and getting awarded with commendations, as I did. And I didn't mind sharing that, because even though they didn't do very little, at the end of the day, they were part of that team, and we did it all together, is the way I looked at it.
Yeah, no, very interesting. What would if you had to analyze all of your strengths, what would be your greatest strength, do you think?
Probably banding people together. I recognize that there are giftings in all of us. And, some people might use different wording on that. They might use skills. They can use all different type of wording. I see them as gifts. So what I do is like to look at people, not necessarily make an assessment of a person, because we're going down the judgment line. But maybe if I'm really determined, I'll get an assessment done of their skill sets, or a profile that has some credibility and a track record behind that, try and draw out their skill sets, their giftings, and then realize myself what those giftings and skill sets are and utilize those. So, you know, in a military context, back in my time, everybody had to do a personal history, and I took the time to read every one of them. And you've got to remember that in that context, every quarter we were training about 320 persons. So, you know, I'd have to know, well, I took the time to read 320 histories every quarter. So, and then when it came to reporting, I wouldn't just write a few comments that would be copied onto someone else's. I would actually go home at night, and rather than having recreational activity, I'd actually comment genuinely on that individual and how best they could improve, etc. But I believe that was important to do the best thing by that particular individual who was displaying the effort required or putting their heart and soul into something they believed in.
Fantastic.
Graham, you mentioned earlier that about community. So tell us a little bit about, what does community mean to you and why?
Well, I would probably go down the word of using the term resilience.
Yes.
And when hard times come, communities should band together, not implode.
Yes.
Do you get any indication of what I'm meaning in that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Totally.
Okay,
Yeah,
so you see a different type of vulnerability with people when you go through a disaster. And disasters in me have created enormous empathy. You know, the ones in the Victorian fires, I saw people that had community narratives built around them that weren't favorable come out and be the shining light in an absolute disaster crisis. And then those that had these glowing narratives, example, you know, the so-called people of society, didn't lift a finger to help their fellow man. So resilience is a big thing for me in community, and I think it's there's a massive amount of vulnerability when you decide that you want to label an individual, i.e., as a misfit of society, because disasters can really bring out the gold in people. And in my situation, I lived 3 weeks in a community with no water, no power, no food.
Wow.
And we all had to help one another. And, you know, I remember the second day in, there's trees falling all around us. And I made this decision to drive from my house to a particular point in town where most of the houses had been burnt in our town. And I drove to this big shed. And I remember I'm nuts. So I had all the windows welled down and I was listening for trees falling, right? And I'm driving through this forest and there's trees on either side of me. So they're not 5 or 10 meters away. They're right beside my car. And every day I drove in and we had guys getting food, doing an enormous bravery to bring in food and resources for the community. And, you know, yeah, it was a really interesting time to see how a community can be so resilient when you drop your guard.
Yep.
Yeah, amazing.
Answers that question for you, Tony.
I agree with you, Graham. I think you could. I'm so, you know, you blow my mind with some of that sort of what we've been talking about, and we could talk for hours and hours on the community spirit. I call it spirit. Of being able to band together and do some of those things. It's just you're right. The golden people always sort of come to the top. The ones that do, you know, the leaders that come out of the community to serve others is amazing. And you're obviously one of those. And congratulations.
Yeah, Well, that was important, that even though I had all these credentials, I remember my wife calling me absolutely petrified. She says, "You're going to run off and go down to another major town, and you're going to go down and save them." I says, "No, I'm not." I says, "I'm staying here. I'm looking after my own community. And no, I'm not running off to be a hero or this or that. I'm staying here in our own hometown." And I just realized that's where I needed to be. And even on the evening that the fires hit us, where I was standing beside my neighbor trying to save his business. I'd worked out that his business was vulnerable. He had pastures, animals, and I had a certain skill set that could assist him to save his livelihood. So that evening, all night, through the night, from 2 a.m. when the fires hit through till 8 a.m., we were just putting out spot fires all around his house and on his property. And, he was one of those guys that didn't lose an animal, and thank God for that.
Yeah. Incredible. So, Graham, if I could ask you, what does the future look like for you?
Oh, it's all calmed down now. So very grateful for that. It's all calmed down. The future look like for me? I've got visions, but I have, and I'm sorry I use that word, but I suppose that in the context of myself here. But when I do think of my kids, they're at an age where they need their dad, and my wife also. And so my wife has a vision to establish a farm, and I've been the servant of that vision. And she keeps calling me the CEO, and she's the project manager. And but I let go, and I let her make those decisions. Whereas normally I might say, "Well, honey, I don't think you should do this," or "I don't think we should do that." I actually let go and let her make those decisions, and we'll have chats. But her vision was to start a particular form of farming, and just the other day we implemented another phase of that farming vision, which is all around nutrient dense foods and life enhancing water.
Yeah. Graham, I'm noticing that we're getting close to the top of the hour. So what we need to do now is I'm going to ask you one last question, right? If there's any one message that you'd want to give to the audience, what would it be?
Well, that's a little difficult, Tony, because I'm unaware who's in our audience. But I'd probably say or share that I found I'd been working extensively in the corporate environment, and I remember moving to Mallacoota, and this particular lady, a very wise lady, by the way, and she said to me, "Gosh, you need to, go sit on a rock and chill out." And I'd realized that in my corporate experiences, I really hadn't sort of slowed down or just pulled back a little and enjoyed myself. I'd been going from one height to the next height. And I think if I look back through all that, I should have probably done that at just been a little bit easier on myself. Because I think when you go through the journey of the road of death, for example, you get a different context on what life's about, and that would be something that I would love to change. And if I could encourage anyone there, is just lighten up a little bit. I'm not saying give up on those things. I'm just saying just probably lighten up a little, because creativity is a lot more available to you when you're not anxious or you're not always doing things. And so it's like being a leader in an emergency situation. If that particular leader or incident controller is in there on the tools, there is no way they are going to see the big picture. Just doesn't happen. Right. So that leader has to step out of that and get that big picture so they can just, put that delegation in place and make those decisions that are really, really well, in the case of, emergency work, some of those things can be life-changing. So, yeah, hopefully I didn't mess that question up for you both.
Thank you, Graham. I think you said it very well. And I'd like to acknowledge you, Graham, for coming onto the show. And my biggest takeaway is your leadership. You've showed a lot of initiative to get things done. I was hearing that when you was in the military, how you could see something wasn't right, and you went to your CO, your commanding officer, and came up with this great idea, and you sold that idea, and you had that passion in your heart to make it happen. And I also like to acknowledge your empathy for other people, because I've known you for a little while now, and I know that you really, your heart's really for people. You're a people person. You haven't told the audience that you've also have got a foundation, and part of it is to help communities. And that's another thing. You love helping people. You love helping communities. And as you were saying in there, how important resilience is for that community. So I'd like to acknowledge you for that you've been giving to the people. I'm going to hand this over to Simon. Simon, what were your main insights? And I'll let you close off the show.
Well, firstly, how long have we got? I think what Graham's talked about today is absolutely amazing. But I think for me, I think, as I said before, I could talk to Graham for hours, I think, because I'm just so, I suppose, thankful for people like him in our community, because it's that empathy and compassion, I suppose, that he gives in that community spirit, that the leaders just evolve as part of that community, and they come to the forefront, and they do things in the community that, as he said, they might be dangerous situations, but it's not that whole thing of, should I do this or whatever. The people just get in and just do it. And yes, I think Australians are very well known for that. Just, it doesn't matter how bad it is or how hard it is. They just get in and just do the hard yards. And I think that's what really shone through for me. I think that community banding together and that empathy and compassion for his fellow community members, I think is very powerful. And I really thank you, Graham, for sharing that with us, because I think that's a beautiful trait to have. So thank you very much. As part of it, as part of a gift of coming on to our show, Graham, because unfortunately you live so far away, I'm going to have to unfortunately eat these.
Close to
me. Again, I'm going to have to. I'm just going to have these myself again, because you live so far away. But no, I really appreciate you coming onto our show, and I think we've had some absolutely amazing guests. But I must say that you're particularly one of our amazing guests that we've had, with just an incredible story to share. And I think that resilience is absolutely shone through. So thank you very much. For our viewers out there, just for your knowledge, Graham, we've got just under 100,000 viewers that regularly tune in.
Wow.
So, you've been broadcast out to certainly a number of people, and we do have, in 2 weeks' time, Tony, we do have an amazing guest. And like I said, I think we did this by mistake previously, that we didn't have the name of our next person. So we said to our audience that we're going to keep them in suspense. And I think, our followers have actually increased because of it.
We've got the magic formula now.
So again, to our viewers, we do
very good
guest in a fortnight's time. So I welcome you to tune in. Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Tony. I really appreciate our Let's Chat today. And I welcome you to come on board again in a fortnight's time, where we'll have another amazing guest with us. So thank you. Have a great weekend, everyone, and I bid you farewell. Bye.
Thank you.